Hello and welcome to yet another Tattered Cover Bookstore virtual event. Tonight we're partnering with Water22 to present an amazing live stream, an amazing conversation. I'm going to let them jump into it, but what I want to say is if you have any questions, you can put them in the YouTube chat and then we'll get them to tonight's guests. And if you need or want closed captioning, it is available at the bottom of your YouTube screen. There's a button that says CC. That'll be closed captions that are auto-generated. But again, please put those questions in the YouTube chat and we'll get them over to the Water22 team. I'm going to hop right off and turn it over to Jayla Poppleton from Water22. Jayla, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this again. I'm going to mute myself and let you all take over.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adam, for partnering with us for this event. We're really pleased to have everyone here for what's going to be a great conversation between a renowned author and a passionate conservationist. My name is Jayla Poppleton. I'm the Executive Director for Water Education Colorado. We are the nonprofit that is spearheading the Water22 campaign, and I'm going to tell you just a little bit about it before I introduce Abby Burke, our moderator, to kickstart the conversation. Water Education Colorado has been around for the last 20 years, working statewide here to ensure Coloradans are informed on water issues and equipped to make smart decisions for a sustainable water future. We have lots of different programs that we run, educational programs. We encourage you to check it out on our website at wateredco.org. But this year we're running an exciting initiative called the Water22 campaign, which is dedicated to the idea that it all starts here. You can see my little button. The concept really is about our role as a headwater state where our watersheds originate water that serve 40 million Americans and 18 downstream states and the nation of Mexico. And we really do have a responsibility for how we steward this resource, not only for all the various water users in our own state, but also those downstream neighbors. And it's just such a precious resource. So we're raising awareness around how critical our water is to everything that makes Colorado such a great place to live, all the different uses that we have for it and the need to balance those uses in an increasingly competitive environment where our water is facing pressures from population growth and the impacts of climate change that are resulting in more severe and persistent drought conditions. And so it all starts here message also relates to the role that we each have to play from whatever position of influence we have, whether that's as a consumer, a homeowner, or a business owner, someone who manages water resources on a larger scale, someone who's engaged in policy and preservation. We all have a role to play in ensuring that we protect and conserve this precious resource for today and for future generations. And you can learn more about the campaign at water22.org. So I encourage you to check that out. But without further ado, tonight's event is part of the campaign. We are running a book club. We have 4 selections over the course of the year. And we encourage you to read along with us. You can learn about the books on the website, in addition to other companion reading and content, and also some youth book selections. Tonight's book, The Emerald Mile by Kevin Fedarko, is the second of 4 selections. And we hope that many of you have read it. And if not, I think that you will be inspired to do so after tonight's conversation. It is an excellent book, very inspiring, very engaging, and just weaves together an exciting adventure tale with some really important history about the Colorado River. So with that, I would like to introduce Abby Burke as tonight's moderator. Abby Burke is the Western Rivers Regional Program Manager for Audubon Rockies, and she's also been really engaged with the Water22 campaign as an advisor on our steering committee. She brings a lifetime love of rivers, particularly of the Colorado River and its tributaries. She's also an avid whitewater kayaker. She's an educator. She's passionate about reconnecting people to their rivers, that's really exciting to me. In her role at Audubon, she also works with government representatives, state and federal agencies, conservation organizations, businesses, and then also recruits and trains community leaders. And she's just committed to advancing riparian habitat and stream resiliency through advocacy and action. So Abby, I'm going to turn it over to you to facilitate tonight's discussion. Thank you so much for being here as our host.
Jayla, thank you so much for that great introduction. And I want to thank our audience tonight for taking time out to join us and really talk about a book that is near and dear to my heart. I do have to let the audience know that you may hear a little rumble of thunder or some downpours. We are thankfully experiencing a little monsoon activity here in Western Colorado, and I'm quite thankful for it. So there might be a little background noise. So the timeliness of, both the Water22 efforts and our conversation with Kevin Fedarko this evening on his renowned and celebrated book, The Emerald Mile. I mean, we're really talking about perfect timing here. People create words, and their words and their power move water in the West. 2022 is a milestone for Colorado's water and the Big River. We have the 100th year anniversary of the 1922 Colorado River Compact, which is the cornerstone of how the river is managed, and the kickoff of the renegotiations of how we manage the Colorado River system. And we have the first update of Colorado's water plan. Words have the power to set into motion how we communicate needs and management of Colorado's water. This confluence of events presents a once-in-a-generation opportunity for people to consider the past, the present, and the future of the Colorado River system and Colorado's water, and choose new words and actions towards greater sustainability for all of us. As a headwater state, as Jayla says, it all does start here. Rivers are born within our state lines from our snowpack. Words of compacts govern how much water we use and for what purposes. Then we move hardworking Western water downstream. And daily right now, our namesake river, the Colorado, is in national headlines because of our climate change impacts and our imbalance of water supply and use of the river and its dendritic tributary network of streams and rivers. Words and their actions matter more than ever. But there's so much more to rivers than just their usability. Their sheer beauty and outsized importance in supporting a diversity of life, and maybe most importantly, our hearts and souls. There's a magnetism of rivers, not able to be easily expressed in words, but maybe only in rich feelings or impressions. That's why Kevin's work in the Emerald Mile is so extraordinary. Kevin's work blends the natural history, grandeur, and wildness of a previously untamed Colorado River with how three adventure and history seekers, driven by heart, to pursue the fastest speed run through Grand Canyon, just as the river nearly took back its wildness. This book is special to me, as I've been a river gal my whole life. This book was given to me by my good friend and whitewater kayaking partner as a gift for my new job with Audubon in December of 2014. A career where I worked to protect the Colorado River and its tributaries for nature and people alike. I am proud to say that I have many laps reading the Emerald Mile, as well as river trips down Grand Canyon. There's no other place so special to me, and I hope for many of you too. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Kevin Fedarko, who lives in northern New Mexico and works as a part-time river guide in Grand Canyon National Park. In addition to his travel narratives and Outside, where he worked as a senior editor, Kevin's work has appeared in Esquire, National Geographic, and other publications, and has been anthologized in the Best American Travel Writing in 2004 and 2006. Kevin was a staff writer at Time magazine from 1991 to 1997, where his work helped garner an Overseas Press Club award. His 2013 release, The Emerald Mile, the epic story of the fastest ride in history through the heart of the Grand Canyon, won a National Outdoor Book Award. And this iconic book is why we are gathered together now. So Kevin, we would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this evening. Is there anything you'd like to address the audience before we dive into our discussion on the Emerald Mile?
Hi, Abby. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you again for joining. Let's kick off our discussion. I'd love to, and I'm sure your readers and our audience would like to kind of have a greater sense of your connection to the Grand Canyon and to the Colorado River. What was that glimmer or that spark that inspired your journey that became the Emerald Mile?
Well, I guess, I have to begin by saying I'm somewhat embarrassed to have to confess that I'm neither a river person nor a Westerner. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, which is a very industrialized landscape. I didn't come out to the Intermountain West until I was well into my mid 30s. And at that point I had never, I'd never so much as, gone up to the edge of the Grand Canyon and looked into the thing, much less floated through the heart of it on the Colorado River. I suppose what drew me to the landscape and ultimately kind of led me on a journey that would take me into the heart of that wilderness and introduce me to the stories that are down there in the subculture of people that have wedded their lives to the river and the canyon was it was actually something some of your audience may be familiar with. It was what's called a WFR course, a Wilderness First Responder course. I was a freelance magazine writer in the early 2000s, traveling to various different parts of the world, mountainous regions. And, the thought occurred to me at one point that it might be good to acquire some basic medical training, backcountry medical training. And so I took a WFR course that was conducted on the river, and was really, used the canyon as an outdoor classroom for that qualification course. And the river just kind of set its hooks into me and never let go. I decided somewhere in the course of that journey that I had to, this is a little bit deranged because for those of you who are familiar with the business of journalism, there are very, very few ways to make even less money than one can as a freelance magazine writer. But an effective way of going about that is to become an unpaid river guide in the Grand Canyon. But I decided I needed to find a way of, suspending my writing career for a portion of every summer and working on commercial river trips in the canyon as a way of learning about that environment and connecting to it. So that was really the first part of the journey for me.
Great. That's amazing. Do you have any particular river trip moment or just a river moment that kind of stands out to you in your journey authoring the Emerald Mile? Is there anything that just kind of, boy, that was it. That was the spark that set the fire to create this amazing book?
Well, specifically in connection with this particular story, this book, I suppose it wasn't so much one particular moment, as much as it was a moment that unfolded each and every day, right around the same time. For those of you who are river people, for those of you who know the canyon, you'll be very familiar with this. It's that moment, late in the afternoon, just as the sun is about to kind of disappear beyond the rim rock off to the west. And, just as it dips below the horizon, it takes those upper layers of rock in the canyon, the Kaibab limestone and the Coconino sandstone and a couple of the other blonde layers, and it turns them this kind of molten color of gold. It paints the top of the canyon, and it also turns the surface of the river gold. It coruscates with light. It's dappled with this dying sunlight, and that precedes the moment on a river trip where the trip leader has selected a camp, a place to stay for the night. You pulled in, you've anchored your boats. If it's a commercial trip, you've de-rigged and you've built the kitchen and you've unpacked all the gear, and the clients have set up their tents, and you've gotten dinner going. And just after that, the twilight kind of begins to unfold, and that golden tapestry of light begins to turn purple and lavender. And that's the moment when the river guides are able to do the only thing that many of them do better than rowing white water and, cooking in a sandstorm and repairing broken gear, which is they sit around and they tell stories. And they tell stories about that place. They tell stories about the river, about the canyon. It's a place to which many of them have devoted, the better, if not the best part of their lives. And what I began to realize over the course of that first river season, I guess we're going back to probably 2004, 2005, maybe 2003. I can't recall right now, but, I began to realize as I sat around and listened on the decks of the boats in the middle of the summer or around a campfire, if it was a shoulder season trip in early spring or late fall, that many of those stories about the canyon were part of a mosaic that really fit together and belonged to what was one story. It was a story about this legendary year and this incredible flood that defined that spring. I'm talking, of course, about the spring of 1983, when, a series of El Nino events created a huge snowpack in the Colorado, in the Southern Rockies and the Mid Rockies, and all that snow melted all at once late in May and came roaring out of the mountains and blasted across the Piedmont and down through the Badlands of southeastern New Mexico or southeastern Utah, and just fire hosed into the upper end of Lake Mead and created a huge crisis at the Glen Canyon Dam, which sits at the head of the Grand Canyon, and which in turn dominoed into a series of crises and a flood inside of the Grand Canyon. And there was this little wooden boat called the Emerald Mile and 3 deranged river guides who decided they wanted to use this flood as kind of a hydraulic slingshot to propel themselves and their boat through the canyon. And maybe if they were lucky, if they could keep from flipping upside down and not getting smashed to pieces, they might set the standing record for the fastest boat ever to go through the Grand Canyon. And that story electrified me, not just because it was it was an exciting story. It was an adrenaline charged kind of, turbo fueled adventure narrative. But I began to, this happens with writers sometimes. We often think in very kind of mechanical terms. And the more I thought about that story, the more I listened to it being told in different ways from different points of view, the more I thought about the more I began to realize that, and here I'm going to speak kind of metaphorically, that boat, that little wooden dory, that 17-foot long wooden dory called the Emerald Mile, she was a marvelous thing. And she had this lovely kind of accomplishment nailed to her deck. But she also, by virtue of, the larger narratives that were tied to her, where she came from, who brought her into the canyon, the era in which she was down there, and the world that she and the other dories that belong to that fleet, the reasons why they fit so perfectly into that place and belonged there, all of that enabled that little 17-foot long boat to kind of act as a cradle and to hold and to carry a much, much larger story, a much larger narrative about this incredibly iconic landscape, about what is really the crown jewel of America's national park system, about how we as Americans have come to view and think about and behave towards wilderness, why we value it, why we've decided to sacrifice parts of it and throw them away, what we've sacrificed in order to save other parts and what that has given us, a whole series of things. And that boat, the story of that boat could offer the opportunity of telling this much larger story. So that's what I just realized I'm doing what I always do, which is I'm just going on and on and on. And I've even forgotten the question that you asked me, but I hope I've addressed and answered it here in some way.
Kevin, more so. That was wonderful. From taking me right back into the canyon and that magic hour light in the evening and listening to stories around the fire pits and just, it was just fantastic. So I may not be the greatest moderator because I could listen to these backstories all night, but thank you for that. But I'd love to, to kind of dive in a little bit more around the crew for the Emerald Mile, since you started bringing the crew up, and the oarsmen, Kenton Grua and Rudy Petchik and Steve Reynolds, as you mentioned, have these braided backgrounds between each other, and often circular relationships kind of with the Emerald Mile itself, the boat, times where they have engaged with it, times where they came back to that boat. The Grand Canyon and the river have been kind of the center, the sun for that kind of that braiding and that connection between these three. What do you think about this crew? Were they reckless or heroes to jump in on this once in a lifetime opportunity to be recorded in Grand Canyon history and lore? What's your personal take on that?
Oh, they were both. I mean, they were absolutely reckless and brainless and crazy. And to their credit, and I say this never having been able to meet Kenton Grua personally. One of the unfortunate aspects of my own saga is that I didn't get to the Grand Canyon in time to meet Kenton. Kenton passed away in I hope I've got this date right. I'm thinking it was October of 2002, and he died in Flagstaff as a result of a congenital defect, an aortic dissection, while he was riding his mountain bike. And so I never got to meet him personally, but I feel reasonably confident in saying that, yeah, he would have fessed up to that label of being, I don't know, he might have objected to reckless, but certainly Rudy and Ren, Steve Reynolds, both of whom I was able to meet and speak with. Rudy is still with us. Ren is no longer with us. I think they had a healthy element of humor and skepticism and humility in what they did. To Kenton Grua's great credit, and I think this speaks to larger qualities of his personality, as well as an aspect of his relationship with the Grand Canyon. He never, that feat that they set a record. They didn't just break the standing speed record in the Grand Canyon for fastest boat in the Grand Canyon. They took that thing and they smashed it. They smashed it so thoroughly that it wouldn't be broken for more than 30 years. And it still stands to this day, in the sense that kayakers have been able to break it twice, but it has yet to be broken and may never be broken by an oar boat, because the conditions that made that run possible, we may never see again. But Kenton was very humble about that. He got the idea into his head because a writer by the name of Colin Fletcher had written a book that some of you may be familiar with. It's a classic narrative of the Grand Canyon. It's called The Man Who Walked Through Time. And it was a book about hiking through the Grand Canyon. And I think, Kenton decided that he wanted to embark on an epic journey that would enable him to connect with the canyon and the river in a very deep and personal way. But he never did it. He didn't do it for money. He didn't do it for fame. He wasn't interested in, if social media had been around at the time, I don't think he would have posted on Facebook or anywhere else. He never issued a press release. He never really bragged about it very much at all. It was sufficient for him and for his two companions that they did it in their minds. They did it right, and they achieved what they were setting out to do. Mm-hmm. But they also broke the rules. They violated a whole range of different things, including flying down the river in the face of the fact that the National Park Service had closed it. It was an incredibly dangerous environment. Giant 37-foot, 2-ton motor rigs were being turned upside down. There were a number of injuries and fatalities over the course of that, what's now known as the spillway crisis, which started in the early spring and ran through the better part of June of that year. And I think they would say, and there's probably a line somewhere in the Emerald Mile to this effect, that it was wrong-headed and dumb and utterly glorious what they did.
Well said for sure. The three in the crew were just some of the, obviously the main characters, the main story, one of the bedrock stories throughout the book. And I'm sure your research has brought to you like many other fascinating characters and individuals with different roles throughout the story in the Emerald Mile. Who were some of the most other inspiring characters to you, and why do they stand out in your memory to them?
Well, there's another, I suppose, in this story, the only character who looms as large as Kenton Grua, if not larger, is a man by the name of Martin Litton, a legendary conservationist who, was responsible for bringing dories into the Grand Canyon and using them commercially. That this design was lifted from a type of boat that was used in the Pacific Northwest on the rivers of Oregon. It was through Martin's efforts, it was modified in certain ways to be able to handle the huge whitewater inside of Grand Canyon. And Martin brought those boats into the canyon. He used them as the foundation of a commercial river company that he built, whose real purpose, he was a terrible businessman, and the purpose of that company really was to promote and educate people and promote conservation and attempt to use outdoor recreation and direct exposure to extraordinary natural beauty as a way of building a constituency of advocates who would fight for the protection of wilderness, who would fight for the protection of and the preservation of parks and public lands in general, not just parks, monuments, pieces of land that do not have the stature of parks, but belong to or administered by other agencies than the federal government. And Martin wanted to see all that protected because he was aware of how savagely it was being destroyed and continues to be destroyed. And that company that he built was an instrument. It was a weapon he wielded in what was really a lifelong battle for preserving wilderness. And I could go on about Martin. His story is complicated, and he was a complicated human being. And maybe the one thing I could say here briefly is that, I never quite figured out, and I still haven't to this day, and it'll be coming up on a decade now since the Emerald Mile was first published. I'm never quite sure where I stand in relation to the principles that Martin adopted. At the time I wrote the book, I had great admiration, bordering on unqualified admiration for a core bedrock principle of Martin's, which is that when it comes to fighting on behalf of wilderness, you do not compromise. And the reason you don't compromise is because wilderness fights, environmental battles, are fundamentally different from a lot of other things in that developers who wish to exploit and leverage and damage and destroy natural beauty and wilderness for the sake of making money can lose as many battles as they might want and still come back and renew their campaign, renew their fight. But environmentalists, conservationists, people who are on the other side of the fence, we can only afford to lose once. Once you lose a piece of landscape, it will never come back. And so Martin believed that you do not sit down and negotiate, you do not compromise, and you don't be polite with people on the other side. You fight them. You fight them with everything you've got. You give no quarter. You expect none. And you engage in a scorched earth form of warfare to do whatever it takes. And there's something much like the much like the speed run that Kenton and his two friends did in the Emerald Mile, there's something kind of glorious about that. But I was a younger man when I wrote that book. Since then, our country has gone through a number of changes. I think we're a meaner place, and we're meaner to one another. And I've begun to question the utility of hating and of demonizing people on the other side. And so I think all of that is to say, and I apologize again for my long-windedness here, all of that is to say that, like many people who accomplish great things, Martin was an extremely complicated person with different sides to his personality and contradictions that wove, in much the same way that the Zoroaster granite kind of threads its way through the Vishnu schist in that basement, oldest layer of rock in the Grand Canyon. Mm-hmm. These contradictions wove through the center of who he was. And one of the challenges and one of the gifts that people who accomplish great things, men and women, leave us with after they're gone is the fact that their story is neither black nor white. And that some of the most interesting and fascinating and challenging and provocative aspects of who they were and what they have to teach and offer us in the form of insight and wisdom resides in embracing and thinking about and wrestling with the gray. And Martin embodied all of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, thank you, Kevin. And it is, that's one of the beautiful elements right now within Western Water, that we have the choice to come together and make the better solutions together versus coming across, pointing fingers, et cetera. It works better when we are together, and water truly does support all of us. And I think some of the most, personally, the most powerful work that I've done is being able to reconnect people to their lands and their rivers, and the understanding that brings, the experiential learning of the beauty and what's at stake as well. And it brings people together. So thank you. Really, really great words. And I know, the research that you've certainly done in the Emerald Mile, I mean, it's just so full-bodied and woven throughout the entire narrative of the Emerald Mile. I was wondering if you would tell us a little bit about your process through that research. And you really brought the history of the Grand Canyon and Colorado River expedition and the construction, the operation of Glen Canyon Dam, and river advocates and river guides like Martin Lind embodied both. You brought all of these people and places to life in your book. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about some of that research and what your process was along those lines.
Yeah, I'll try to do that. I'll try and keep it brief, and I'll try and maybe tie it to the comments that you just made as you kind of pivoted off of the remarks that I made in reference to your last question. I suppose my research, it began on the river. Initially, it was empirical and hands-on, and it largely consisted of simply, being a volunteer at the very bottom of the totem pole on Grand Canyon commercial river trips over the course of 4, 5, 6 seasons. Working on the river, trying to do something I don't always do well, which is to listen more than I blab, and observe and take notes and try and get a sense of and a feel for this subculture of people who I knew were directly tied to and part of the community to which the main characters in the book belonged. And in the course of meeting those people, I began to do what always happens on the river, which is that you begin to absorb the passions and to some extent the politics of the people you surround yourself with and are trying to learn from. And as we all know, river guides, Western river guides, are very passionate about rivers and free-flowing rivers. They tend to hate dams. They tend to be environmentalists and conservationists. And over the course of the first couple of seasons, I came to adopt a particular frame of reference and point of view. And it was a moral point of view with respect to what was going to emerge as the other big character in this story. The canyon's a character, of course, but so too is the structure that rests at the center of what happened in 1983. I'm talking about the Glen Canyon Dam, this giant, 710-foot tall wall of concrete that was dropped into the head of the canyon. And by the time I started the book, I had come to decide that largely through maybe spending a little bit too much time and drinking a few too many beers and whiskeys with river guides, I had become convinced that the structure itself was evil, and so too were the people connected to it. The men, and I'm going to say men here because they were at the time almost all men, the men who designed it and managed it and were responsible for it were villains. They had committed a crime against the landscape, against the river, against the canyon, against the forces of nature that define that place. And I saw the events of 1983 through the lens of that moral compass. The flood that came down out of the mountains and threatened to take out the dam, or certainly take control of the river away from the engineers and technicians and managers who thought they controlled it, was a kind of a moral reckoning. And my intention was to write a book that really delivered that message. And the problem that I encountered about halfway through the process, when I got done talking to the river guides, was that I realized at a certain point, you can't tell a story about a giant 710-foot tall machine without talking to people who know how it runs. And so I had to go out and I had to make contact with and speak to the men who I was preparing to villainize in this book. And I ran into what turned out to be an intractable problem, which was that despite my best efforts, I was unable to hate them. I actually ended up really liking them. I ended up really respecting them. And I discovered that it's possible to do those things and still disagree with a whole bunch of other things. What I discovered was that the Bureau of Reclamation engineers and managers and technicians of the Glen Canyon Dam were deeply proud of their work. The perspective they had on dam building and engineering was absolutely fascinating. And the events of 1983, the spillway crisis, it was a point of pride for many of these people. It was, they took a runaway river, the most legendary river in the Southwest, and they stopped it. And for them, it was a heroic fight that ended in preventing terrible damage to being done to that structure and possibly losing control of the whole thing. And let me just wrap it up by my thought process here by saying that I came away from those meetings with a redefined sense of what my role was in writing this book. I decided that my role was not to write a polemic which told people how to think about the Colorado River, the Grand Canyon, and the Glen Canyon Dam. My role was to tell in the most compelling manner possible a story of almost like two republics within the same space, with very, very different values and very different senses of history and a different sense of right and wrong, and tell that story with enough respect and objectivity that anyone who somehow managed to plow their way through all 416 pages of it or whatever it is could make their own decisions about all of it, whether it was right, whether it was wrong, whether it was somewhere in between, and how they felt about that place and what we've done to it, what we've sacrificed, what we saved, what the future should look like or should not look like. And so I think it's interesting to me that I guess before I became an author, I thought that writing books involved acquiring wisdom and then dispensing that wisdom outward. It never occurred to me that the process is almost exactly the reverse. When you sit down to write a book, you turn into a very dumb person, and the book is the thing that educates you. The most privileged person in the whole process is the author. He or she gets to be pulled like the caboose on a train through a series of lessons by this thing that they think they're creating, but which is actually reshaping and their own sensibilities and points of view. And it was a very, very rich journey for me for all of those reasons.
Terrific. Kevin, that's wonderful. What a great metaphor of the caboose being pulled through. And that's, I definitely resonate with that. And I'm glad as you brought up through your research that, the Bureau of Reclamation and the dam operators and the conditions they were facing in '83. And, they had this enormous responsibility to be protecting lives and property downstream. And, the river is kind of in a very different state at this point. Bureau is having to certainly wrestle with a couple other things. But, in 1983, Glen Canyon Dam was almost lost due to an abundance of water. And today, with extremely low reservoir levels in both lakes, Powell and Mead, there's worry about not being able to move water through the dams downstream. And I'm wondering if you, in the research and in the time that you've spent writing and architecting with the Emerald Mile, are there any parallels you can draw to the federal government's kind of management of those major Colorado reservoirs today? Any lessons learned from '83 that could be brought forward into a very different water, condition that we have now? Any thoughts on that?
I don't know. It's a good question because it's a tough question, and the like off the cuff response is, oh, there's no difference whatsoever because these are categorically opposite conditions. We're never going to see probably the conditions that we saw, the crisis that we witnessed in 1983. Our problem now is the opposite of what it was then. We don't have enough water, and back then we had too much. But it does occur to me that maybe one thing that one thread that's common to both eras and is perhaps potentially illuminating in some ways is that I think it has to do with what I think of as one of the central lessons and insights that the Grand Canyon itself teaches. And to really kind of appreciate it, you need to go back and take a look at what we did to the Colorado River. Between the early 1900s and the 1970s, we took the wildest and most ungovernable river in the American Southwest, and we throttled it to the point where we turned it from a living river into a giant piece of plumbing. And it's not just one dam. It's not just, the Glen Canyon Dam or two dams, Glen Canyon Dam at the head of the Grand Canyon and Hoover Dam at the, beyond the Grand Wash Cliffs at the end of the Grand Canyon. It's a whole series of dams. You could probably tell me how many there are. Dams and canals and irrigation structures and water compoundment systems. And it's a giant system of plumbing that has been so exquisitely designed and is so extraordinarily efficient that, by one reckoning, every drop of water that flows through that system, every drop of water that that lands in the form of snow or rain in the Colorado Rockies and somehow makes its way downstream in the direction of the Sea of Cortez is used and reused up to 7 times. And the only thing that's maybe even more striking than that is the fact that that drop of water, with the exception of a very, very brief period for a couple of months a few years ago, no longer reaches the sea. It dies. The river dies in what was once its delta and is now a desert just above the mouth of the Sea of Cortez. And the act of building all of that infrastructure, that engineering, required enormous hubris on our part. I mean, the amount of confidence and arrogance and bluster and brilliance that it takes to think about harnessing the energy of something that is the definition of wildness, a river, and bending its forces and then transforming those forces from kinetic energy into forms of energy that can benefit human civilization, electricity, hydropower, whatever. All of that is deeply arrogant. And it is the very opposite of what you learn when you spend time inside of a landscape like the Grand Canyon. Spend enough time down there, and I can go on about this for far too long, but it has to do with the age of the rock, the scale of the landscape, and the feeling of smallness that is instilled in you as you try and paddle through the bottom of it. And the central lesson, the central insight that landscape has to offer and deliver to you is a profound sense of humility. And I think that lesson applies regardless of whether we're dealing with too much water or too little water. We built the system that is now creating and exacerbating problems that we're trying to find solutions to from a standpoint of enormous arrogance. And the only way that we're going to work our way out of it and find good solutions that offer balance and justice to all of the people who depend on that river is by embracing humility, is by backing off of and retreating from the mentality that enabled us and led us to create it in the first place. I realize we're probably running out of time, so I'm going to pull myself up short here, but that would be my off the cuff response to this good question that you asked.
That's great. Yes. Humility as we come forward and kind of see ourselves in the space that the river is today, in the reality of the river today, for certain, with balance and justice. Yes. Good words. Kevin, we have time for a few more questions, but I want to remind the audience that they can put in questions into the YouTube chat. Those will be transferred over to us, but we're going to keep the conversation going. But audience, you are definitely invited to add in your remarks through the YouTube chat feature. So thank you for that. And, Kevin, as we kind of start to wrap our session together, I was curious if you had any specific objectives for what you hoped the book might inspire when you published it. I've heard these elements, throughout our conversation this evening. But did you have any specific goals for this book when it came out? And have you seen those goals or objectives realized since the publishing of The Emerald Mile?
That's a good question too. I don't know that I ever really thought about that. I think I did have some goals. Back when I first, dreamt of putting the whole thing down on paper, I think I maybe touched on one of them, which was the realization that there was a much larger story there, and that I didn't want to simply write an adventure story whose purpose was merely to entertain. I was looking to, I suppose, I'm a little bit sheepish about having to admit this, but it's true. I suppose what I was trying to do was, it was an act of subversiveness on my part. It was, I made a conscious effort to take, I think what I referred to a few minutes ago is like this turbocharged adventure narrative that was potentially very exciting, and use that to draw people unwittingly into a much larger story. And in the process, open up not just a landscape, a physical landscape, but also a landscape of complicated ideas and complicated history, and deliver all of that to them through the vehicle of this adventure story, and which really amounts to kind of an act of subterfuge and fraudulence, perpetrating on readers. And it's interesting to me because, I'm an author who's made the mistake of going back and reading some of his Amazon reviews, which is never a good idea. And if you dip in and read some of the 1 and the 2-star reviews out there, you will discover how many people, how upset they are with me for having misidentified this book, of having falsely advertised a book that they were expecting would be a lovely piece of entertainment, and it turns into a giant piece of homework. But that was one of my goals. And the other goal, and I'm not sure I could have stated this at the time, but I think it was always in the back of my mind, because when I heard it was happening, I had a moment of recognition. And I hesitate to say this because it may make me guilty of the very same arrogance that I was just kind of denouncing. But I wanted to write a story that would be embraced and loved by the people who, had allowed me to come into their community, had shared their time and their ideas with me, and had trusted me with their stories. I wanted to write something that they would be proud of. And it has come as a great surprise and a great privilege when I hear that, that book is, apparently it's read around the campfire in the same way that, back when I was in my first river season, I was listening to stories around the campfire or on the boats in the summertime at night. I guess there are some camps down in the Grand Canyon where the Emerald Mile is taken out and read. And I don't know that there's any greater privilege that could be granted to, the author of a book than to hear that about it. So that would have been, that was a goal I would not have been able to state at the time, but I can now see through the rear view mirror, and am filled with gratitude for the fact that it has come to pass.
Absolutely. Kevin, I can validate that impression because of the knowledge of my landscape of river friends and family, and how the book is read and read aloud, and has just broadened the understanding of the river to no end. So I personally thank you for the amazing research and time and dedication that you have poured in to this book particularly. And I know we're getting short on time, but I do want to ask one last question. And then I'll cue up Jayla here in just a moment. But this amazing body of work that you've done through the Emerald Mile, the research, the writing, the reaching to people and the discussion of it, has this affected kind of the trajectory of other work that you're pursuing or other aspects, your professional life? Are there a part 2 coming? Is there's what might what's this work potentially inspired that continues on in your life now?
Yeah, I suppose it has, because the thing that you're supposed to do with a book like this, if you're a writer, if you make your living writing books, is you're supposed to spend X number of years, I think it was like 10 in this case, kind of writing a book, and then you get to the end of it and you submit it and to a publisher, and the thing gets sent to China or wherever it is that books are printed, and then it comes over on a cargo ship and gets sent out to bookstores around the United States. And meanwhile, the person who created the book does what he or she is supposed to do, which is to go off and do the next thing, to find some other story, to find some other project, to find some other landscape, whatever, and plunge into that. And it's both a blessing and the great blessing and curse of my life that, the canyon and the river set their hooks into me many years ago, and they've never let go. And so, not long after the Emerald Mile was published, I was drawn into yet another project, another story. This is a story that, was very personal. I was invited by a very good friend of mine, a photographer by the name of Peter McBride, who's a very kind of a legendary National Geographic photographer and filmmaker. in a nutshell, Pete convinced me. He came up with a terrible idea, convinced me to join him. And we spent the better part of a year, actually more than a year, moving on foot from one end of the Grand Canyon to the other. Not across the canyon from the north to the south rim, but down the throat across the entire length. We started at Lee's Ferry. We came out 14 months later at the Grand Wash Cliffs. We actually did it in a series of sequential hikes, and we would emerge from the canyon to reprovision and rest and go back in and link them together like links on a chain or pearls on a necklace, whatever, image you want. In any case, that is a book I've been working on for the past 6 years. So it's yet another story about the canyon. And this is a story that it's fascinating to me because one of the insights that drove the Emerald Mile, one of the core beliefs I had throughout the writing of that book was that the essence of Grand Canyon, the center of the place, the core of Grand Canyon, if you want to understand Grand Canyon, it's the river. It's the Colorado River. It's the thing that carved and created and polished the thing in the first place. It infuses the bottom of this giant theater of baked dead rock with vitality and color. You cannot understand that place without being on and in the river. And really it holds everything in it. And I have come over the course of the journey that we made on foot, which was of course not along the river, but through the cliffs between the shore of the river and the rims of the river. I've been convinced that is not true. That is not true at all. And one reason is an idea that I touched on earlier. We think of, partly because those rapids are so challenging and huge, and we feel so small in them, we think of the river as the essence, the embodiment of wilderness, of wildness, of untrammeled nature. And of course, it's not. It's plumbing. Every drop that goes through there is metered and rationed and scheduled by the Bureau of Reclamation. If you want to experience true wilderness in Grand Canyon, if you want to really go out there and feel what it's like to not be in control, you have to leave the river behind. You have to move through that matrix of rock, those cliffs, those bands of rock that stretch between the banks of the Colorado River on the left and the right and the rims. And that journey has not diminished my love of or respect for the river, but it has imbued it with an appreciation for another aspect of that landscape, which runs just as deep. And that is what I'm attempting to chronicle and communicate in this story.
Oh, remarkable, Kevin. Thank you. My heart is delighted knowing that there is something else coming. And so just thank you for bringing that entire landscape to life for so many through your research and your writing and your experience and your love of place. But I want to thank you again for your time. I want to thank our audience for their time. And I would like to invite Jayla to come back on and kind of close us out. But again, Kevin and audience, thank you so much for a really enjoyable 45 minutes or so together. I really enjoyed that so thoroughly. So thank you again.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I 100% agree with you, Abby. Kevin, we could keep listening to you for a long time. You're a fantastic storyteller and really make me want to get back down to the Grand Canyon myself. I had the pleasure of rafting a portion of it once about 5 years ago and would really like to get back down there. But the book is really inspiring. And I personally think you were brilliant in your fraudulence to weave your adventure narrative with that really rich history and just educational offering. And it was one of the reasons that we selected it for the book club, and really hope that folks that were on the line tonight, if you haven't read The Emerald Mile yet, we encourage you to do so, and it is available for sale by the Tattered Cover. So pick up a copy. And before you sign off for tonight, I just want to give you a few plugs for how you can stay engaged and join the flow of the Water22 campaign, which is ongoing through December. We do have a pledge that you can take to commit to 22 ways to care for Colorado water in 2022. It's a combination of ways to save and conserve water indoors and outdoors and to protect water quality. So these are just easy actions that anyone can take at home to really start getting involved in being a steward of the state's water future. And then, if you want to get more involved, we have other ways to plug in more deeply on the water22.org website, including right now, taking a look at the state's updated Colorado Water Plan, which has been released for public comment on June 30th. And there's a 90-day review period. And the state is really looking to hear from people about what's important to you when it comes to our water and what you want to see for the future of water in Colorado. So everything from small things to big things, there's ways that you can be part of the state's water future. And we encourage you to plug in at water22.org. Also pick up the next book club selection, which is The Man Who Thought He Owned Water by Tertia de Elgin. And we switch gears to look more at a story around agricultural water use on Colorado's Eastern Plains. Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you, Abby. That was just fantastic and really rich and special. And Kevin, good luck with the project. And we can't wait to see what you come out with next. And Adam, thank you again for being our host. I don't know if there's anything that you want to say in closing.
The only thing I want to say, there is a question. Yes, this is the YouTube link. You can use it as often as you want and share it. You can watch this as many times as you want. And then we'll email all of the viewers a link again. But thank you all. Thank you for a great talk. It was a pleasure. I hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Take care.
Good night.